Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome to the Keiser Report. It's, one of those shows where you need to get out your air sickness bag or your vomit bag. We're about to talk about one of the worst cases of predatory banksters defrauding and abusing the poor and sick that I've seen in a couple of years. We've introduced you to many instances of bankers preying on folks, but this is really epic, Stacy.
Yes, well, first let's set the scene. You and I have talked about the healthcare system here in America, where America is essentially a hospital, but a predatory hospital masquerading as a country. So something like 19% of our GDP is hospital care, is medical spend, is so-called healthcare. One of the largest employers in the entire nation is the health industry, mostly low, paid sort of help staff in healthcare facilities, like cleaning the floors and changing nappies and stuff like that, and they get paid like minimum wage. But here's a story that went viral. Probably many people out there watching this saw it, and that was in Los Angeles. An LAPD officer saw this woman, clearly homeless woman, carrying her, her shopping cart full of her belongings in the metro system there. And she was singing this beautiful opera, which we won't play because it's probably copyrighted. But it turns out mysterious viral LA subway singer is revealed as classically trained musician who was made homeless by medical bills and had her $10,000 violin stolen when she was forced out into the streets. So this is the reality of America. This is why so many people live paycheck to paycheck, is the legal, it's made legal, as Bastiat would say, by the apparatus of the state, is legalized plunder.
Right. America is essentially a corrupt hospital disguised as a country.
Yes.
And you have the jobs, I just saw an ad for medical billing professional. So they are great at sending out bills all the time for services that they don't provide. The so-called Obamacare, when you put the deductibles into the mix, they don't provide health care. They simply extract wealth. They're essentially similar to the energy industry extracting oil and gas from the earth, or the bankers with their fractional reserve banking extracting economic vitality. The healthcare industry extracts people's money from their pockets and makes them a lot more ill. The infant mortality rate in America is up. The life expectancy in America is down. So, clearly this is not working.
Now, actually, when I retweeted this, somebody responded, "Why doesn't she just get health insurance?" And it's like, So we're going to cover that, what actually happens for those like ourselves. Say we pay $25,000, $26,000 a year for a health insurance product. But one thing to note is that most health insurance products, the vast majority in America, only cover in-network. Well, when your health insurance provider negotiates in-network prices with a particular hospital or a particular, doctor. But did you know that most of those hospital emergency rooms and many doctors and many hospitals are actually owned by private equity? And private equity doesn't like the reimbursement rates that even these horrible insurance companies are able to negotiate. So they force all their doctors working in the emergency room or all the ambulances to be out of network. So the vast majority of out of network surprise billing is for ambulances and emergency rooms. But this past week, while everybody's focused on some crazy the latest conspiracy theory fake news on all the cable channels of this Ukraine gate, which I don't even know what it's about, but Ways and Means Chairman Richard Neal is proposing a new surprise billing fix that will essentially just punt the problem to the administration to figure out. Yes, apparently we were on our way to stopping surprise billing, but KKR and Blackstone, two of the largest private equity groups in the entire world, well, mystery solved, private equity-backed firms are behind ad blitz on surprise billing. 2 doctor staffing companies are pushing back against legislation that could hit their bottom lines. They spent $28 million lobbying and pushing ads on television. Nobody knew who they were. Facebook ads, they spent millions on Facebook ads and basically got the whole surprise billing. We were going to stop it. Our legislators were going to stop it on our behalf, but now they're not going to.
Right. This all in-network, out-of-network. So even if you have insurance, if you are out of network in a facility in an emergency room, for example, you get charged this exorbitant fee. That, with the case of the woman who's singing in the subway, she was faced with catastrophic health care bills, as are millions of Americans every year who end up homeless because of the vagaries of the system that creates these hardship cases for the benefit of private equity investors, not for the benefit of the average citizen. So you have in-network, out-network. And again, this is an example of apartheid in America. If you're outside of the network, you're living in a Bantustan, and you're being subjected to fascism by Blackstone and by KKR. If you're in the network, if you have the wherewithal to game the system, if you're, for example, a congressman, they don't even have the same healthcare system, it's their own private situation that they created for themselves, then you're living out of the Bantustan.
It's actually a little bit more like feudalism, a neo-feudal system, the lords and then the serfs, the people outside who have to scrape by for a living and are just plundered. It's so predatory, the whole system. Like, I'm going to read you some of this story, and it's so shocking how, like, we can't see ourselves, like, we can't help ourselves, we refuse to help ourselves, and like, we actually don't have to submit to this, but we do. Like, we don't have to abide by this, but we do. Like, we allow this to happen. And by the way, KKR and Blackstone Group are very, very, very politically connected. They're friends with the Clintons, they're friends with the Obamas, they're friends with the Trumps. These guys, the multi-billionaires that run these companies are very, very close. And you could bet that Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden or Donald Trump care way more about those guys that run those firms than 100 million voters in this country. So, like, just understand that you don't matter. These people do. So early this summer, Congress appeared on its way to eradicating the large medical bills that have shocked many patients after emergency care. The legislation to end out-of-network charges was popular and had support from both sides of the aisle. President Trump promised his support. Then in late July, a mysterious group called Doctor-Patient Unity showed up. It poured vast sums of money, now more than $28 million, into ads opposing the legislation without disclosing its staff or its funders. Now that mystery is solved, the two largest financial backers of Doctor-Patient Unity are Team Health and Envision Healthcare, private equity-backed companies that own physician practices and staff emergency rooms around the country, according to Greg Blair, a spokesman for the companies. So Blackstone Group owns Team Health, and KKR owns Envision Healthcare. So again, you know, in the emergency room, what happens in case, you know, a lot of people who support our current system actually haven't been there. So often if you know what an emergency room looks like, you know, there's people that are dying, they're unconscious, they're in a coma, and they don't have the ability to read all the data and ask each person checking their chart. And this is what these companies do. How they do this surprise billing is they make sure some guy, some woman, some intern, somebody goes and checks your chart, just looks at it, and then they could charge $15,000 because they were out of network.
Right. It's a duopoly by two predatory banksters, KKR and Blackstone. They own all the emergency rooms as private equity acquisition. They made these acquisitions for multi-billions of dollars, and so they prey on the sick and dying. So they're able to monetize the sick and dying. Remember last year we reported on Tim Geithner, former New York Fed head and
former Treasury
Secretary, who left that job to become a predatory lender. These guys are into monetizing the sick and the dead for their maximum personal gains, and it's a sick plague that has swept America, and we don't need to it. It doesn't add anything to it. We know we're this god-awful, corrupt hospital masquerading as a country. And it's just guys like Kohlberg, Kravitz, and Roberts who are like in the operating room. And they even have ambulances that are kind of go around, and you almost get the feeling that they're causing accidents so they can cash in on the carnage on the street.
I don't know about that, but in terms of Blackstone Group, by the way, they are also the largest landlord in America. I'm talking about neo-feudalism. Here they run predatory practices in a moment where you have no choice and you're not able to make a choice in an emergency situation. Blackstone Group, because of Timothy Geithner, is the largest landlord in America, the largest private landlord. If you rent a home, you're probably renting to Blackstone, and that's because of Timothy Geithner's policies, that were supposedly to bail out the good people of America. Well, actually, it was a gift and a handout to Blackstone Group. So now they own most property. And again, like when you see all this hysteria that's been going on, especially our cable news, all the elite on the news, are becoming more and more and more hysterical. And you see that especially since the financial crisis. You see them acting in total hysteria, and they keep pointing fingers in total witch hunts about all those people overseas, those people in Russia, those people in Ukraine, those people in Libya, those people in Syria. It's all of those people. Now look at how this is projection of what they themselves are doing and what they're afraid of all, the 320 million peasants in America. 10 million aren't. So 320 million peasants are so afraid of what you're going to find out. But they can't help but project. Doctor-patient unity has also spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on Facebook and Google advertising and has been spending direct mail to voters in dozens of congressional districts. In some cases, the group describes the legislation as the first step towards socialist Medicare for all dream. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on ads. They didn't say who was backing it. They didn't say it was Blackstone and KKR financing these ads. Hundreds of thousands. And nobody's up in arms. Rachel Maddow doesn't care about this, but apparently a $60,000 in ads spent, against Hillary Clinton's $1 billion can melt and morph the minds of the American people. But this is just like.
All right, Henry Kravis is basically a grave robber, right? He's a KKR. That's one of the initials of KKR. So ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Washington Post, New York Times. Would they interview Henry Kravis and say, why are you...
You bloodsucker.
Why are you a blood-sucking pig? Why are you stealing... Why are you roaming around emergency rooms and ripping people off and stealing all their wealth and killing our country, Henry Kravis? Why are you doing that? None of those news organizations are interested in that story. So you have essentially... what can you say about it?
Okay, again, most people have had the good fortune of not having to be in the emergency room or not having to be with an elderly parent in the emergency room and sitting there for hours and seeing the shock and horror and the situation, the crisis situation that is there almost nonstop. And the fact is, every single person that's coming in there is vulnerable. You hear people crying. You hear people screaming out in pain. You hear people screaming about their dying child.
And there's Henry Kravis. Give me your money. Give me your money. I'm a.
Well, it's even worse than that. It's like they're not even announcing themselves. They're just like, while you're bent over your dying child crying, they're like going in your back pocket and lifting out your wallet very quietly and running away. And we have, as I said about Bastiat, we've legalized this system of plunder. And it's going to be, right now it's 19% of our economy. It's going to be 50% one day as the plunder is allowed.
Henry Kravis, the Jimmy Savile of Wall Street. All right, well, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, much more coming your way. So don't go away. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn back to our conversation with Mitch Feierstein. Mitch, welcome back.
Great to be here.
Now, in the last episode, we established your bona fides as a legitimate Wall Street creature that's been working in the bowels of finance for decades, and you know the ins and outs of everyone, everybody, everything. You're a walking encyclopedia of finance. You wrote Planet Ponzi. You predicted negative interest rates. I got to ask you about Jeffrey Epstein for a second because, there's a story, in the paper that they're unable to find any indication that he actually ever traded anything post his job at Bear Stearns. So this is just a curiosity here because apparently no journalist in America can find evidence that Jeffrey Epstein did anything in finance after his Bear Stearns job. But I know, talking to you and others, that he was very active. How come he's an invisible man in finance like this?
Look, if somebody wants to trade and they don't want their name to be out there, you're not going to find the account that they're trading with because the counterparty that's going to be given as the counterparty name is going to be one of the clearing banks that they use, and they don't give up the name. So that's if somebody's trading, you can never tell who's really behind the trade. You'll get the counter. They have to have a clearing bank, so nobody's going to say who their clients are. Goldman Sachs, Credit Suisse, whoever the Lehman Brothers or whoever the banks were, that you were clearing through would never give up the names.
All right, so this is part of the whole, Panama Papers report that we saw come out recently. There's a $20 trillion, shadow banking system of family offices and all kinds of skullduggery going on that is very rarely seen. So that's where he lived, apparently, in his post-Bear Stearns career. I guess that accounts for it. Let's jump to Hunter Biden. Hunter Biden, son of Joe Biden. Again, you see a Wall Street guy. So how unusual is it for a guy to make $600,000 per year as a board member when what would be more than paid as a board member of Goldman Sachs, for example? This guy looks as dirty as the day is long. What's your input on Hunter Biden?
I think that it's pretty interesting that on his resume, he was kicked out of the Navy for doing crack cocaine or something. And he didn't seem to have any experience in the natural gas or commodities. So I don't know why, that natural gas firm in the Ukraine would have hired him and paid him anything unless it was, a backhander. But look, Hillary Clinton got away with backhanders from many companies in the Clinton Foundation. And what was done? Nothing was done. So you've got a two-tiered system of justice in America. Why would we think it was different? I mean, the Clintons were pay to play when Hillary was Secretary of State as well. The Bidens are no different. However, I think what's going to happen is there are going to be documents that Hunter Biden, I'll bet you this, has signed that are going to appear with payoffs in Ukraine. There's also a problem they have with China because he also raised a lot of money out of China when he flew over there on the vice president's jet with him. So for Sleepy Joe to deny all this is kind of crazy, and eventually the story will come out, unless we live in a world where, they can cover up anything, which I'm starting to believe may be the case.
It's amazing that what it looks like anyway, I mean, I'm just a guy here with a TV show. What it looks like is that Trump called out the Bidens for corruption in Ukraine and China. And the Biden's response is that somehow Trump is interfering with his election campaign. He's interfering with his run for president because he had the temerity to point out that his son is corrupt. That seems, and the media, of course, in America, sides with the corrupt Bidens, right? So I was looking at ABC, CBS, NBC, Washington Post, New York Times. I've yet to find a mainstream media outlet in America that doesn't think that it's Trump's fault to point out the corruption rather than the Biden's fault for committing the corruption, Mitch.
That's Hillary Clinton's Saul Alinsky deal, isn't it? I mean, you try to accuse the other people harder of what you're really doing. I mean, it's the smoke and mirrors.
In the first half of the show today, Mitch, we covered the story of surplus medical billing wiping out Americans. Now, this is really, truly a disgusting story. I had to put on my vomit bag to deal with this. Much of it happens in the emergency rooms where Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts, of course, Henry Kravis, and Blackstone, they own doctor groups. They shake down comatose patients with out-of-network charges. Now, they're grave robbing, essentially, for profit and making billions doing it. Will private equity do to our medical system what they did to the retail industry, Mitch?
Private equity shouldn't be involved in this. I think the government needs to get involved on the price fixing, and they need to seriously revamp the way they do things. I mean, the bills that you can get for medical care in America are ridiculous, and it needs to be examined. But none of the politicians, because the politicians are all paid off, have the will to go in and do something about it. We need to see a change. Trump promised changes. I don't think we've seen changes. What we're going to get, and I hate to go back to this, but it looks like Hillary is throwing her hat in the ring for 2020 because she's on every network with her new book again. She's had a new book.
Wait, I've got to get a second vomit bag now. I'm running out of vomit bags. Hillary, back, oh my God, I feel quite nauseous. Speaking of nausea and vomit bags, let's return briefly to the WeWork saga, because this company's business model was the first thing they teach you in business school not to do. Lock in long-term leases and then try to bail yourself out with short-term leases. I mean, this is like kindergarten mistake level stuff. but they thought they could go public with $47 billion of this charade. I mean, what the heck, Mitch?
It's absolutely bonkers. I mean, I identified that as a Ponzi scheme back in January. And look, what was it? The Vision Fund at SoftBank was the one that bankrolled it. I don't know what he was thinking. And, you know, even the mission statement, and if you had read their IPO document, it was crazy. So what did he do? He had a speculative company purchasing real estate and selling it back to himself, long-term leases and short-term coverage. They never made money. I don't think the business model can make money. So I would not be surprised if it goes bankrupt and puts Vision Fund in receivership in Japan. And, you know, it wouldn't be the first time one of these Japanese funds blew up. So I think the lessons have not been learned from the Japanification from the 80s until now, or 90s until now, where they've had negative growth and stall for 30 or 40 years. We're learning the same thing where we've had neoliberal policy that's been failed for 40 years, and we're going to follow the role of Japan. So think about WeWork, think about the Japanification, and think about the Western markets doing exactly what Japan's done, and it's going to get even uglier, I think.
Right, this WeWork CEO, he was so stupid or so crooked that he was taking out these long-term leases in buildings and then allowing landlords in competing floors in those buildings to undercut him. That's how freaking stupid this guy is. Of course, he made off with close to $1 billion in ill-gotten gains, and he's gone from the crime of the scene. It was an exit scam. He makes some of these ICOs in the crypto market look legitimate. This WeWork crook.
Wasn't he smoking pot on some flight to Israel and they threw him off the plane or something?
The shareholders would have been well benefited if they threw him actually literally off the plane from 30,000 feet, but unfortunately he was able to land. Now, let's move on. Finally, U.S. tariffs on European goods. Stilton cheese is on the list. This is the only agricultural product that has any respect at all coming out of the U.K. Everything else, of course, coming out of the U.K. agricultural-wise is garbage. Whiskey, Pecorino, and Gouda, those are good cheeses. Can the global economy take any more of these tariffs, Mitch?
The World Trade Organization granted, I think, 7.5 of the tariffs, and I think they originally wanted 9 billion in tariffs, I think that it was. So they downgraded it. But I think that the tariffs, I think a lot of countries have been taking advantage of the U.S. position. So I think most of that has to do with Europe. I think the EU is broken. I don't think they'll be around in 5 years. I think that the structure of the EU is fundamentally flawed. You've got the European Commission, which nobody has any say in putting those people in office. They do closed-door deals, all backhanders. It's really, really draconian.
Yeah, I get it, but what about the tariffs, Mitch? You got tariffs now all over the world. Everyone's engaging in tariffs. I made the comment earlier that this is what happens when you go off the gold standard. You try to recreate it by doing all these tariffs. Tariffs are basically, not only are they an act of war, but they just, economically, they just pile up on each other, and they don't ultimately work, do they?
Yeah, don't you remember what we've discussed? And I said that first there's a currency war, then there is a trade war, and then there's a hot war. That's the way that it proceeds. And this is what happens at the end of empires. And I think that this is the direction that we're headed in. So, I see that this is a very, very bad direction that we're headed, because massive amounts of corporate debt that we have right now. You've got a rollover of BBB and junk bonds, something to the tune of 5.5 trillion between now and 2024. I don't know where that is going to, who's going to buy that stuff, because the market's already oversaturated with government debt. So BBB and junk, I don't know where that's going to find a home, especially after WeWork goes to zero. So you're going to see a lot of defaults coming into the market, and that's going to be problematic for everybody.
So on the subject of tariffs, going back historically, remember during the 30s, you had the Smoot-Hawley tariffs applied that were part of the whole depression. Ray Dalio, of course, heading up Bridgewater in Connecticut, the biggest hedge fund in the world, I believe, is now saying that we are repeating that exact history. That trade wars are now going to lead to hot wars. He thinks China and America are leading into a hot war, and various countries are now taking sides. We got about 30 seconds. Your thoughts?
I think the tariffs with China are fairly justified, and I think that they're a lot bigger than the ones with Europe. The ones in Europe are small fry. I think they need to do something to figure out the balance of payments between China and America. I think that this is a way to start with tariffs. I think it'll escalate into a hot war? I hope not. I hope nobody's that stupid. But look, I think that we're in desperate times, and desperate times call for desperate measures. I just hope that our governments are not that stupid to get involved with yet another war to fund military-industrial complexes.
Well, you know, stupidity is trading at a new all-time high on the various exchanges around the world and heading even higher. Common sense at a new low. Mitch Feierstein, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks for having me, man. It's a pleasure.
Okay, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Mitch Feierstein of PlanetPonzi.com. If you want to reach us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report, or check out KeiserReport.com. Until next time, bye, y'all.